Have you ever had a really important appointment? I had such an appointment this past week. Really important. Very important. Really, really, really important. It was Wednesday morning. I actually had to go and report for jury duty. Now, I will tell you, I have mixed emotions and mixed feelings on this topic. You go, why? I actually love our judicial system. I think it's one of a kind. There's not one, as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I'm aware, anywhere else in the world. That we live in a country where it's of we the people, right? So if you are arrested and charged with a crime, because we live in a constitutional republic, make no mistake, we don't live in a democracy. We live in a constitutional republic, right? Where it's not a monarchy, it's not a dictatorship. There's not one man that will look at you and say guilty, not guilty. It's actually a jury that is put together of your peers. And so you have a man or a woman who is a prosecuting attorney that will make their argument and say, this is why I think this person is guilty. You have a defense attorney who will stand up and say, these are the reasons that I think that this person is not guilty. And here's another amazing thing about our country. If you can't afford an attorney, there will be one appointed for you. Truly amazing when you stop and think about it. And I actually do. I think there's only one judicial, sorry, my wife put a note here and I just saw it. I forgot an announcement. We're going to do it at the end, so hold tight. Squirrel. There's only one judicial system that I'm aware of that I like better, and it is actually a monarchy. It is actually that we have a king who sits in heaven, and he's the one who's all authority. But here on earth, we do the best we can, right? So, you go through the process, and you show up early on Wednesday morning, and the whole idea is that they're going to go through a series of names. You sit in a room with a couple hundred people, and they start calling names, and it's a pool of people that they're going to draw from to assemble a jury. And I will just tell you, I went, and I prayed a lot. Lord, please don't let them call my name. Just matter of fact, my man Frank right there. Frank was with first guy I saw when I walked in the door. Frank's there. We sat together for 3 hours and we prayed. Please don't let her call her name. I will tell you, I'm a little jaded by the whole system, and here's why. So it was actually years ago I got called for jury duty. I got selected. I got on a jury. We go through the whole case, and part of the reason that I was a bit jaded was because a good friend of mine, he's actually here today, he plays professional golf. He invited me to come to the Masters. Listen, golf people, he invited me to caddy for him at the par 3 tournament. And I had jury duty. Doing my civic duty. And here was the case, ready? 2 women got in a fight, and one bit another one. And that's why we were there. So I'm sitting in this courtroom and I have all these thoughts going through my mind. Are you kidding me? The time, the money, the effort, all of this that we're going through because a lady bit another lady. And I'm thinking to myself, how would you handle it if it were your kids? Right? Because our kids bite each other once in a while. What do? Right? You do. Yeah. Someone just said, bite them back. That is not the advice that I would give you. The advice that I would give you is that you can apply the higher hand of learning to the seat of education. Right? The Bible says, spare the rod, spoil the child. And so I'm thinking to myself, if this young girl would have got dealt with at a young age, we wouldn't all be sitting here. But nonetheless, so I go into the jury duty box, and I'm a little jaded, but, thank God, 3.5 hours, and they didn't call my name, and at the end, the girl gives a clipboard, and, okay, sign your name, and you're released, you can go. And thank you, Jesus. So that was my week. What about you? Have you ever had an important appointment? Maybe it was to see a doctor. You think you might be pregnant, ladies, and you decide we want to go ahead and make sure that we get confirmation that the Lord has blessed my husband and I with a child. Maybe it's that child grows a little bit and you want to go meet the teacher on the very first day of school. The very first day you're going to let this child go to school without you. You want to know who the teacher is. You want to know if they're a nice person. You want to know what kind of things they're going to be investing and pouring into them. Maybe they get a little bit older and it's time to get a driver's license. You have an appointment for that. Maybe it's a potential new college. Your child is going to go off to college and they're going to start to live their life. Maybe it's a job interview. Maybe it's later on in life and you're not feeling so great and you schedule an appointment with a doctor and you find out that's a little more serious than you thought. There are times in life where we are going to have very, very important, very special appointments. Church, we're going to look at such an appointment today. It's an appointment between Jesus and a woman. Now I want to go, if I can, real quick. So we look at the very first word in verse 1 of chapter 4, and it says, therefore, and I shared this with you last week, that's a connective word, right? It's a linchpin word. It's tying together a couple of thoughts. So let me, if I can, real quick, right? We've seen Jesus over the course of the last several weeks and several months have different scenarios where he showed up, and he did different things, right? So there was the wedding in the beginning, then he went into the temple and he started flipping over tables. Then he has a conversation with a man named Nicodemus, and now he's going to have a different conversation. Now, church, listen, I'm going to draw some parallels for us today because I think it's really important. Number one, you have a man in Nicodemus where we know his name. You have a woman here where we don't know her name, and you'll see that in a minute. We have a man who is seeking. You have a woman who is very indifferent. You have a man who is highly respected. You have a woman who's an outcast. You have a man who's very serious about his seeking or his quest for Jesus. You have a woman who's very flippant in her responses. You have a man who's a Jew. You have a woman who is a despised Samaritan. You have a man who's very moral. You have a woman who's very immoral. You have a man who's orthodox. You have a woman who's heterodox. You go, what is that? She's open to anything. You have a man in Nicodemus who's very specific about his faith. You have a woman in this woman that's very open to anything. You have a man of the word, you have a woman of the world. You have a man who's very learned in his religion, you have a woman who's very ignorant in hers. You have a man who approaches Jesus in the cool of the night, and in this scenario, you have Jesus approaching a woman in the heat of the day. There could not be more difference in these two conversations in these two people. And I love that as I lay that out. Why? Because I think a lot of times we can come and just maybe come to church. Maybe you're here for the first or second time. Maybe you're just kind of questioning your own walk with the Lord. And you have these thoughts that come across your mind like, Lord, do you even care about me? So here's the dichotomy, right? You have a man in Nicodemus who is way up here. And then you have a woman who is a Samaritan who is way down here. The title of my message today, church, listen, The Bad Samaritan. You guys are familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan. Today we're going to look at a woman that is, in many people's eyes, the Bad Samaritan. And so we pick it up in verse 1, chapter 4. It says, therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus had baptized and discipled, more disciples, than John, though Jesus himself did not baptize, but his disciples. I need to clarify something right now because you may have conversations with people and they may throw this phrase out there to you once in a while and you're not sure what to do with it. And the phrase is this. You know there's a lot of discrepancies in the Bible. You know there's a lot of errors, there's a lot of inerrancies in the Bible. And you go, well, where? Well, there's a lot of things that contradict themselves. Now, this might be one of those sections where someone might say that. You go, what do you mean? Well, look over real quick at verse 22 of chapter 3. We're going to read this. Look at what it says. After these things, Jesus and his disciples came to the land of Judea, and there he remained with them and baptized. Now, if you didn't know any better, you'd look at verse 22, and then you'd look at verse 2 in John 4, and you go, wait a minute. Those two things don't go together. Like one of them saying he baptized, one of them saying he didn't. Okay, here's what we do. We study the Bible so that we know what it is the Bible declares. Verse 2 in chapter 4 is accurate. You go, what do you mean? John is very clear to go, Jesus did not baptize. And again, I have a theory about that, and I shared a little bit last week about my experience in Israel and Pastor Fidel baptizing in the Jordan and having a line of like 50 people, and the rest of us standing there with nothing to do because everybody wants to get baptized by Pastor Fidel. Right? I assure you, if Jesus was in the water, they'd be like, I'm getting baptized by him. Right? Because I don't know these other guys very well, but he's like, if he baptizes me, it's going to work. The idea is that Jesus was down at the water's edge, more overseeing the baptism that his men were doing, if you will. So just a little clarity on that, just in case we get confused, because John is very clear. Jesus did not baptize, but his disciples did. Verse 3. He left Judea and departed again to Galilee. Now, real quick, it's important that we understand. Notice in verse 1, it says, the Pharisees heard that Jesus made. So here's what happens. Jesus, church, is starting to show up on the radar of the Pharisees. Okay, they have long been looking at John the Baptist. And if you remember last week, I talked about how he kind of handed off the baton. Like, I've done my work. You know, I'm the guy who paced the race. And now I'm handing it off to Jesus because this is ultimately his ministry, and so he does. Now all of a sudden, Jesus is hitting the radar of the Pharisees, and they're starting to pay attention to him. Now, Jesus is not leaving out of fear, it's out of convenience. You go, what do you mean? He has work to do. He has ministry that he needs to do, and we find ourselves this morning with one such scenario. So verse 4, look at it, it says, but he needed to go through Samaria. Any of you have a King James version? King James, old King Jimmy, anybody? Okay, right here. What does it say? He must needs go through Samaria. I actually like that better. Why? It has more of an urgency to it, right? See, what happened is Jesus is going from Judea to Galilee. He's north and he needs to go south, and he's going to detour a bit and go hit a place called Samaria. Why? Because he has an appointment. He must needs go through Samaria. So we pick it up in verse 5. It says, so he came to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar. We're going to come back to that in a moment. Near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, sat thus by the well, and it was about the 6th hour. Here's what I love about John. John is doing a masterful job of kind of painting the backdrop and painting, kind of the scenario that we're going to find ourselves here in a moment. So you have these men, they are journeying, right? Jesus, church, listen, by all worldly accounts, he's poor. He doesn't own a horse. He doesn't own a donkey. He doesn't own a camel. They're on foot, and they're in the middle of the desert. Okay, it gets hot where they are. And so Jesus gets to the point where he arrives at the well and he sits down and he is wearied. Here's what I love. We are getting a chance to see the deity of Jesus play out. We're going to see it in this chapter, okay? The deity of Jesus is this, that he is 100% God, but he's also 100% man. Church, listen, it's not 50-50, it's 100-100. It's truly amazing, his makeup and who he is, right? He is 100% God in the sense that he heals. Right? He heals the deaf, he heals the blind, he heals the lame, he raises people from the dead. But at the same time, 100% human, he goes through things like you and I do. He gets tired, he gets hungry. I don't know that he got cranky. I don't. He's sinless, but we did see him flip over tables a couple of weeks ago. He gets weary. How many of you ever get weary in life? A lot of ladies are smiling today. Why? Because your kids went back to school last week. You're going, I was weary. Jesus is wearied from his journey, but notice it says that it is also the 6th hour. This is high noon, church. High noon. A very important detail, again, as we start to unfold this story. And now John has given us this backdrop as to where we are and what's happening. And so in verse 7, a woman of Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, give me a drink. And here's what we know. We have a woman who has just showed up at Jacob's well at high noon. There's a couple things that you need to know culturally as to why this happened. Chances are that she is somewhat of an outcast. Okay, because women back then, culturally, they would oftentimes go to Jacob's well and draw water, but they would do it together in groups. It was kind of like a community for them. They would go either in the cool of the morning or in the cool of the evening. They never went at noon. Why? Because they're carrying these rather large vessels, these large jars. We'll get to that in a moment. But the heat of the day, they would never do that. The desert is unique. It's not like Florida. Florida during the summer fluctuates about 1.5 degrees. Right? I mean, it's like 95 in the day and like 93 at night. It's just so lovely during the summer. The desert it's just much different. There could be 40-degree swings between the heat of the day and the cool of the night. And so they would actually go in the morning, they would go together. It was their little community. They would hang out. It's kind of like if you see a couple of ladies that are just walking in the morning in your neighborhood. Very similar. That's their time together. They're going to get together and talk about their husbands and their kids and all that kind of stuff. And it's just, I just need help. I need help with my everything. But they gather together and they journey to the well and they go to get water. This woman is alone and she is going in the heat of the day. She's very isolated in her life. We're going to start to unpack that as we see this conversation begin to unfold. And so Jesus actually takes the first step. He takes the initiative and he speaks to her and he says, "Woman, give me a drink." She's taken aback by this. Why? Because Jewish men, especially Jewish rabbis, would never initiate a conversation with a woman, ever. As a matter of fact, ladies, listen to this. Jewish rabbis, oftentimes walking around the streets during this time, if they saw their wife coming toward them, they would ignore her in public. Fellas, try that. We have counselors waiting on standby for you. So the fact that Jesus would initiate, being a Jewish man, being a Jewish rabbi, would initiate a conversation with a woman at all is significant. But he asks her something, and clearly, guys, so this whole section, this whole passage could be considered evangelism 101. Right? We're going to see just this conversation unfold, and it truly is some things that I think we can grab onto and we can apply to our own lives if you have somebody that you are trying to evangelize or share the gospel with. Just masterful how he does this. Now, here's the thing, right? So he says to her, "Give me a drink." Now, I thought about this. This is the one who created the heavens and the earth. This is the one who created man. This is the one who fed the 5,000, the 4,000, literally created the water that she's about to draw. But he can't get a drink for himself because it's not so much about the water as much as it is about the woman. And so he says to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city. This was very common. Rabbis, when they traveled, if they ever stopped somewhere, they would usually never eat the food where they were. They would send their disciples into the city to buy food. I think Jesus did this very specifically because he knew this conversation needed to be a very private, very one-on-one conversation. So he sends his disciples away. Verse 9. Then the woman of Samaria said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, a Samaritan woman?" Now, before we move on, I got to be honest. I've read this passage many times. I learned something this past week, church. And it was this, right? So notice what she says next. "For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Now, the implication is Jews are up here, Samaritans are down here. We're going to get to that in a little bit. And so Jews never talk to Samaritans. As a matter of fact, Samaritans are considered, church, half-breeds. Okay, when Solomon was put in charge to build the temple, and God gave him very specific instructions. "Solomon, this is what you do. You live your life in such a way. You live your life in purity." What did Solomon do? He started to intermarry with other races, and it wasn't so much the intermarrying of other races, it was the fact that they had other beliefs. Now, I always get this part wrong. Solomon either had 300 wives or 700 concubines. Is it the other way around? 700 wives, 300 concubines? First time, 300 wives. Okay, 300 wives. 300 wives. 300 mother-in-laws. God was very clear, Solomon, don't do it. Solomon does. The intermarrying or the intermixing, if you will, got to a point where the king of Syria one day ostracized or isolated all of these groups of people to a mount called Mount Gerizim. They were basically deported, if you will, to live on this place. Why? Because they couldn't intermingle amongst the Jews any longer. And so you have this woman. She is a Samaritan. She is a half-breed. True Jews, pure Jews, looked down on the Samaritans as if they were just the lowest of the low. Okay, very important that we understand that. All the more it makes it interesting that Jesus would start a conversation with this woman. Now notice what she says. How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan, for a drink? Okay? And I always looked at it like, well, makes sense, right? Jews are up here, Samaritans are down here. But the more I read this church and the more I started to dig in, here's what I realized. This is a bit of a slur. This is a bit of a nasty comment that she makes to Jesus. Why? Because the Samaritans hated the Jews just as much. Right? So Pastor Andre is in the back. I'm going to use him as an example. He has no idea. It's okay. I'm not going to say anything bad. It would be the equivalent if I said to Pastor Andre, how is it you, being an Italian, would want to say something to me? Right? It has a bit of like, it's a jab, it's a sting, like you're a Jew. Not like that race hasn't heard that before. But she says it, and I believe there's just kind of this on her behalf, like you shouldn't be talking to me, and quite honestly, I shouldn't be talking to you either. So you can see just the tension and the contention that exists even in the initial parts of this conversation. So she throws this question out to him, and Jesus responds, listen, church, if you knew the gift of God and who it was who gave you, or who says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Now here's what's interesting. So here's what Jesus is saying. Basically, if you knew who I was, you would ask me, and I would give you living water. Now, a couple things I want to, and I'm going to give away part of our story here. Many of you are familiar with this section. Some of you may not be. We just read it a minute ago. This is a woman who has had 5 husbands, and she's now living with a man. And we're going to park it right there because I'm going to dig deeper into that in just a moment. But consider this. Here's a woman who has, I'm sure, lived a life of being taken advantage of. And it just, I wonder if for the very first time in her life, a man approaches her and says, I want nothing from you, but I've got something for you. I've actually, if you knew who I was and the gift of God that I am to you, you would realize that I'm offering you something called living water. Living water, right? The relationship with God that is just life instead of death, that is flowing instead of stagnant. I wrote it down this way, if you're a note taker, my first thought, if you will. When you consider that you are trying to share the gospel with somebody, listen to this. We must first diagnose the condition before we can prescribe the prescription. Right, so there she is. She's there just to draw water. And I'm sure, quite honestly, church, the low light of her day. Every single day when she has to go out at high noon by herself in the midst of the day, I'm sure people are talking about her. They see her. Oh, there she is. She has no friends. Nobody wants to associate. Nobody wants to hang with her. This is not something she looks forward to by any means. But Jesus says to her, listen, if you knew who I was, you would ask me for living water, and I would give it to you. The woman responds and says to him, sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Now, I actually have a belief as you look at this 3-word phrase, the well is deep, the well is deep. I believe that is a picture of her soul. Stop and think about this woman and just where she is in life, right? Again, she's on her way to a well by herself. Her life is absolute misery as far as we can tell. Now, we don't know how she ended up on her 5th husband and now the man she's living with now. We don't know if they all passed. We don't know if they all just left her. We don't know if they, how all of these marriages played out. But nonetheless, there's clearly a reputation that this woman has where nobody wants to associate with her. And so she's there and she says to him, the well, sir, is deep. And again, I believe that's a picture of her own soul, what's happening. And Jesus is going to very strategically and systematically start to dig past the dryness and the hardness of her heart and dig deep into her soul. Where then do you draw this water? Where then do you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock? And Jesus responds to her, Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain springing up into everlasting life. Jesus is already starting to prepare her for what her life's going to look like. Because later on, she's going to leave and she's going to say to people, come see the man who told me everything that I ever did. The impact of this conversation changes her so radically, but yet right now he's going, listen, when you grasp, when you understand what it is that I have to offer. Think about this. This woman has been looking for satisfaction, gratification in all of the worldly places. Because we're all guilty of that. Right? From time to time, all of us will look to get satisfied in a way that is other than what God intended. I asked you earlier to turn to Jeremiah chapter 17. Would you flip over there quickly? Jeremiah chapter 17. It's a verse in here that many of you are familiar with, but I don't know that starting in verse 9, Jeremiah 17:9. Jeremiah gives us some insight into what it is that Jesus is presenting to this woman now. Verse 9, it says, the heart is deceitful above all things. And when I read this, just kind of consider where we are in our conversation and where this woman is. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Now, real quick, if you ever hear that phrase in the world where people say this, just follow your heart? Can I just give you some advice? Don't. Okay, just don't. Your heart will lead you astray every single time. It is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can even understand it? Verse 10, I, the Lord, I search the heart, I test the mind, even to give to every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his doings. As a partridge that broods but does not hatch, so is he who gets riches but not right. It will leave him in the midst of days, and at the end, he will be a fool. A glorious high throne from the beginning is the place of our sanctuary. And this is the key verse, verse 13. O Lord, the hope of Israel, all who forsake you shall be ashamed. Those who depart from me shall be written in the earth because they have forsaken the Lord, the fountain of living waters. So Jeremiah gives us a heads up that God is the one who is the fountain of living waters, that he is now presenting himself to this woman at Jacob's well, having a conversation, trying to lead her into a place where she starts to realize that the life that she's living is empty and God has something so much greater for her. Picking it up in back to John chapter 4, picking it up in verse 15. The woman said to him, Sir, give me this water that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw. I think we're starting to see her open up a little bit. Here's what I think she's saying. I don't like my life. I don't like what my life has become. I don't like what it has evolved into. I don't like what just every single day, again, I wake up and I'm reminded of the exact same thing, that I am the town harlot, that I am the one who carries shame and I'm despised, and people talk about me and they look at me and they point at me and they whisper at me and I have nobody. Guys, think about this. Proverbs 18:1 says this, a man who isolates himself rages against all wisdom and seeks his own destruction. The Bible talks about the dangers of being alone. This is not a choice that this woman has made. Nobody wants to associate with her. Now, I don't know if anybody outside of this man that she is living with is willing to open up and have a conversation with her, but for the first time, possibly in a while, possibly in years, someone actually talks to her. Someone actually sees her. Somebody actually cares about her. Somebody actually is presenting hope to her. And she's saying, wait a minute, you have something that can change my life in such a way where I don't have to come here and draw water anymore? Verse 16, Jesus says to her, go call your husband and come here. And the woman answered and said, I have no husband. Now, this, if we're not careful, can be misunderstood and misinterpreted. Not so much for us, the reader, right? We know who Jesus is. We know that his motivation is pure. He loves this woman. He wants to lead her into a relationship with him in a spiritual way, in a pure way. But here's what you need to know. It wasn't uncommon for men and women to start a relationship at a well. Right? When you think about Abraham and him saying to his servant, go find Isaac a bride. And where does he go? Where does he meet Rebekah? At a well. Actually, several times in Scripture where this happened. So think about this. Jesus saying to her, go get your husband. She could have misinterpreted this as, I'm interested. You go, what do you mean? Men, if you're single, you may look at a woman's hand, and if you don't see a ring on her finger, you may say to her, I don't see a ring. Are you married? It could be very similar. It could have been taken very similar in that way. And then notice her response. I have no husband. That could be her saying, I'm single. I'm available. Right? You're wanting to know if I have a husband? I don't. But notice what Jesus does next. He says, you have said well that I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you have now is not your husband, in that you spoke truly. Here's what's interesting. She didn't lie, right? She didn't have a husband. She just didn't give him the whole truth. Yeah, I don't have a husband because the man I'm living with now is just a guy. Probably the only guy that would even give me the time of day or even consider me in any way. But guys, listen, this is so crucial that we see. So I love about Jesus. He's not afraid to point out the truth, right? So he says to her, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you're living with now is not your husband. Write this point down if you want to. It's this. There's no true conversion without true conviction. Right? He says to her, basically, woman, you're in sin. And he's not afraid to say it. Why? I wrote it down this way. He reveals her sin, but he doesn't revel in it. Right? He's not afraid to say, listen, you are living in sin right now. You've had 5 husbands. The man you're living with is not your husband, but he doesn't park it right there, but he's going to say it. Why? She needs to hear it. And I don't know if she probably already knew this or not. I don't know. Chances are she was living with the shame of her decisions, but nonetheless, Jesus is willing to point it out so that he could say, hey, we got a problem here and we need to deal with it. Listen to what 1 Corinthians 13, 1 through 3 says. You don't need to turn there. I'll just read it for you. It's the love chapter in the Bible. Paul writes this, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but I have not love, I have become a sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and I understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains, but I have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. Jesus tells her something that is a truth that I'm sure was not easy for her to hear. But I love the fact that he does it in such a way. She doesn't run away. There must have been something about his tone, his expression, whatever it was very loving in nature. He wasn't afraid to tell her the truth, but he did it in a very loving way. Church, we can learn something from this, can we not? We must be willing to tell the truth, but we have to do it in a loving way. Jesus, obviously the master of that. I certainly don't think any of us have mastered that. We do our best. He has, obviously. But he says to her again, the man that you are living with is not your husband. You spoke truly in that regard. Verse 19, the woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. I don't know why, I found that funny, right? She walks up to a man, she's never seen him before. He starts a conversation with her. She has to be thinking, how did you know that? How did you know that deep, dark secret that I carry? How did you know that reality of my life that is just a weight of shame that hangs around my neck every single day? I perceive that you're a prophet. Now notice what she does next. And for those of you, this is a really, again, when it comes to evangelizing and sharing your faith with somebody that you're trying to win over for Jesus, right? A very, very tactical tool, a very tactical thing that Jesus does right here. Watch this. Verse 20. She says, Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and the Jews say in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship. Now notice what she just did. Jesus just pointed out a sin in her life, and what does she do? I'm going way over here. I'm going to talk about worship. Right? Because I don't want to have this conversation. I really don't want to talk about the sin in my own life. So I'm going to deviate over here. Church, listen, you may have conversations with somebody and you're sharing your story. Maybe you're even willing to say, I know that you're doing this and you're living this way and it's not right. It's not right in God's eyes. And somebody's going to go way over here and go, yeah, but what about this? Here's the tactical tool. Ready? Always bring it back to Jesus. Always bring it back to the cross. Always bring it back to the sin that separates somebody from the Lord. They can go over here and talk about whatever they want to do. That's great. Okay, fine. Bring it back. Bring it back to Jesus. He's going to do that. Notice she says this. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and the Jews say in Jerusalem is the place to worship. Now, real quick, what's the mountain? They're on Mount Gerizim. Okay, that's what it's called. Mount Gerizim is right there next to Mount Ebal. Mount Gerizim literally means this, the cutting off or disgrace or shame. That's literally what Mount Gerizim means. Mount Ebal is the mountain of blessing. So in essence, Mount Gerizim is the mount of cursing. Mount Gerizim is the mount of blessing. She's on Mount Gerizim. That's where the Samaritans lived. Okay? Now we know this, that the temple to worship was built in Jerusalem. That was the true temple where the Jews would go to worship. Well, Samaria built their own temple up on Mount Gerizim because they weren't allowed to go to the temple in Jerusalem to worship. So they said, hey, we'll build our own temple here. We'll just have our own faith, our own philosophy, our own worship. We'll just do that here. And here's what's interesting. They actually believed and held to the Pentateuch. The Samaritans did, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. But we know this, the true place to worship was at the temple in Jerusalem. So if they couldn't go to the temple and worship in Jerusalem, their worship was incomplete. This woman is now stuck with a dilemma. The Jews and the Samaritans, they are separate. She's a Samaritan and she's trying to figure out, how do I truly worship God if I'm this? Church, listen. It's been that way for centuries. You go, what do you mean? Isaac is the child of promise. Ishmael is not. We are still seeing and dealing with the tension that is happening in this conversation, although be it small. We're seeing it play out today. You go, what do you mean? I don't know if you know this, church. In the Middle East right now, it is a tinderbox. Iran is kind of puffing their chest out and rattling their saber going, we're getting ready to attack Israel. And it could happen literally at any minute. So what happens if that happens? Whole lot of decisions that need to be made. Because Russia's going to stand up and go, we're in. China's going to stand up and go, we're in. And the United States is going to have to make a choice. Now, I'll be honest, I don't know who's making choices these days for us, but nonetheless, someone is going to have to decide, do we get involved and do we support our brothers and sisters in Israel, or do we sit this one out? Personally, I think if we choose to sit it out, that will be our downfall. Right? The Bible says this, Israel will become a cup of trembling in the Middle East when all this goes down. Now, make no mistake about it. Israel's going to be fine because God will protect her. Us, I don't know. We have a choice to make. And I pray that we choose wisely. But nonetheless, so this is the dichotomy that we find here, and it goes all the way back. So here we have, again, Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal, the Jews, the Samaritans. They are separated. Down in the valley between these two mounts is a place called Sychar. That's where Jesus went, or he's on his way to, and he stops in Samaria because he has to have this conversation with this woman. What's fascinating is, down in the valley of Sychar, if you remember, that's where Moses set up the Ark of the Covenant, where the 10 Commandments were. So that's where the Word of God was, so that they could go from the Mount of Cursing through to the Mount of Blessing and pass through the 10 Commandments, God's law, to get there. So you have this kind of give you a little bit of backdrop as to where they are. And now this woman is saying, hey, on this mountain, this is where we worship. We can't go to Jerusalem. Verse 21, notice what it says. Jesus says, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you were neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. What is Jesus saying? Salvation comes through me. I'm a Jew. I am the King of the Jews. It comes through me. Verse 23. But the hour is coming, and now is, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. Notice this next line, what he says. The Father is seeking such to worship him. Now, I got to be honest with you. I don't know that it's changed since Jesus uttered these words. Right? When you consider 2 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 9, listen to what it says. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him. So here you have this lady talking about her fathers, but Jesus again redirects the conversation to talk about what? His Father. Masterful. Bring it back to God. Bring it back to the cross. Bring it back to Jesus. He says this, they must worship in spirit and in truth. Verse 24, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. My third thought, if you want to write this down, it doesn't matter where you worship, it matters how you worship. We're in a hotel, right? Many of you regularly will come up to me before and after a service and just say, I feel the presence of God when I walk in here. It doesn't matter where you worship. It's interesting, right? We know that Jesus said in John chapter 14, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. He says, you're going to worship me. You must worship in spirit and in truth. Spirit and in truth, right? It's the Spirit. It's the truth. It's God's word. It's Jesus. He said, that's how you worship. Here's where we have to kind of land the plane and bring it to a close. Verse 25. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, who is called the Christ, and when he comes, he will tell us all things. Now, the Samaritans actually had a belief that God would come back on Mount Gerizim to the Samaritans. That was their belief. It's playing out right before her, right? She goes, I know that God is coming. I know that Messiah is coming. And when he comes, he's going to tell us all things. Notice what Jesus says, verse 26. I who speak to you am. You go, Pastor, wait a minute. You forgot the last word there. No. In your Bible, it should be italicized, correct? That word should be leaning a little bit to the right. You know why that is? It wasn't in the original statement. The authors, they put this in there so grammatically it would make sense for you and I. Jesus stops the statement right there. He says, I am. Goes all the way back to Moses. Goes all the way back to chapter 14 in Exodus. Goes all the way back to the conversation where God said to Moses, you tell Pharaoh that I am sent you. Although there are 7 I am statements in the book of John, and this technically isn't one of them, it kind of is, because he stops right there and he says, I know that Messiah is coming back on this mount. I'm him. I don't know what is stirring in her heart as he makes this statement. To be continued. We'll get to more of it next week, but the conversation continues just a bit. But we see this impact that has taken place, I believe, in this woman's life that have led her to a place where I think for the first time in a long time she actually has hope. You can write down my final thought this way. And I know it's going to contradict my third thought, but that's okay. I wrote it this way: it doesn't matter how you worship, but who you worship. Because he says to her, I who speak to you, I am. Listen, I don't... I don't know where you are today in your walk. I don't know where you are today in your journey, so to speak, with the Lord. Whether you've been attending a church for years, whether you've been walking with God for decades, or whether this is your very first time and you got invited by a friend, I hope and I pray that throughout the course of our time, we have gotten a chance to see a side of Jesus that I don't think gets talked about enough. Right? The fact that he would cross all cultural lines, all cultural barriers, sit down with a woman that most people would not, because he loves and cares about her, even putting his own reputation on the line for the sake of someone who is living a life that is shameful, that is disgraceful, that is hurtful, that is harmful, where he gets to a place where he says, I must go to Samaria because I have an appointment with a woman so that she knows there's hope. I pray that for you today, maybe today that was your appointment. Maybe God led you here to let you know that he sees you, he loves you in spite of all the stuff you're going through, in spite of all the stuff that you're carrying, but you matter to him greatly. The fact that he made it so that you could come here today and hear a story about a woman that nobody else would give the time of day, but Jesus would literally give his life for. Nothing's changed. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Amen.